On a Friday afternoon in October of 1996, on the eastern shore of Cape Cod near Chatham, Massachusetts, the United States Coast Guard lost a boat worth $850,000. The storm had been building for 2 days. A nor'easter, the kind that Atlantic mariners have respected since before America was a country. By Thursday night, the wind was hitting 60 knots and the waves were running 15 feet. At 03:22 hours Friday morning, the Coast Guard Station Chatham received a distress call from a fishing vessel taking on water 8 miles offshore. Station Commander Lieutenant Robert Cahill dispatched motor lifeboat 47238, a 47-foot response vessel designed for exactly this kind of weather. The lifeboat found the fishing vessel and took off the crew, 3 men, hypothermic but alive. Mission successful. But on the return trip, in darkness and driving rain, coxswain First Class Michael Torres misjudged his position by 200 yards. The lifeboat hit Old Harbor Reef, doing 12 knots. The impact drove the vessel onto submerged granite boulders that had been ripping hulls open since the 1600s. The fiberglass hull breached in 3 places. The boat lodged between rocks, lifted by each wave, and slammed down again, taking more damage with every surge. The crew got off safely, rescued by the backup boat, but motor lifeboat 47238 stayed on the reef, impaled on rocks 200 yards from shore, tilted at 30 degrees, hull cracked open like an egg. By Friday afternoon, when the storm finally broke, Lieutenant Cahill stood on the beach with a Navy salvage engineer and looked at a problem that shouldn't exist in the modern Coast Guard. "Assessment," Cahill said. The engineer, a lieutenant commander named Patricia Walsh, consulted her waterproof tablet and tidal charts. The vessel is grounded on Old Harbor Reef at mean low water depth of 6 feet. The rocks are granite, extremely sharp, with irregular spacing. Hull integrity is compromised in at least 3 locations. The tidal window for any recovery operation is approximately 90 minutes between high tide cycles. Can we pull her off? Not safely. The reef formation makes it impossible to position a recovery vessel close enough for effective towing without risking a second grounding. The hull damage means any pulling force could break the vessel apart, and the tidal cycles don't give us enough time to rig properly. So what are our options? Walsh looked at the stranded lifeboat. We scuttle her, controlled demolition to prevent her from becoming a navigation hazard, salvage what equipment we can at low tide, write off the hull and order a replacement. Cahill stared at the boat. At $850,000 of taxpayer money sitting on rocks that had been sinking ships since his ancestors sailed from England. How long to get a replacement? 8 to 12 months. There's a waiting list. Cahill closed his eyes. Station Chatham was down to 2 operational lifeboats. If they lost another one to mechanical failure or damage, they'd be unable to respond to offshore emergencies. "Do it," he said. "Get the demolition scheduled. Salvage what you can." That's when a 1951 International wrecker came down the beach access road. Let me tell you about Ezra Blackwell, because you need to understand the man before you understand what he did. Ezra was 78 years old in 1996. He'd been born in Chatham in 1918, the son and grandson of commercial fishermen who'd worked Cape Cod waters for 4 generations. He'd enlisted in the Navy in 1942 when he was 24, and America was 1 year into World War II. The Navy needed salvage crews, men who understood maritime conditions, who could work in rough seas, who knew how to move vessels that didn't want to be moved. Ezra had spent 4 years with Navy Salvage Unit 12, working the Atlantic convoy routes. He'd helped recover damaged Liberty ships, pull submarines off sandbars, salvage cargo from vessels torpedoed by U-boats. He'd learned to read tides, understand bottom composition, calculate pulling forces in conditions where mistakes meant losing equipment worth more than most towns. After the war, Ezra came back to Chatham and did what Blackwell's had always done. He went fishing. bought a dragger, worked the Georges Bank, made a living pulling cod and haddock from water that was getting emptier every year. In 1951, when a surplus military equipment auction came through Otis Air Force Base, Ezra bought a 1951 International L-170 wrecker that had been used by the Navy for shore-based recovery operations. Paid $900 cash. He modified it for Cape Cod conditions, added corrosion protection, waterproofed the electrical system, installed marine-grade cable and a winch system that could handle salt water. For 45 years, Ezra had been pulling boats off beaches, vehicles out of sand, and equipment from places where tow trucks from Boston refused to go. On that Friday afternoon, Ezra heard about the stranded lifeboat on his marine radio, heard the Coast Guard discussing scuttling procedures and replacement timelines, heard Lieutenant Cahill authorize demolition. Ezra put on his fisherman's sweater, started the International, it fired on the second try, like always, and drove to Old Harbor Beach. The Coast Guard crew saw him coming. The International made a distinctive sound, a deep mechanical rumble mixed with the whine of the marine-grade winch. Then the truck itself appeared, a boxy, old-fashioned wrecker with heavy corrosion from 45 years of salt air, painted dark red, with BLACKWELL marine recovery barely visible through oxidation. Lieutenant Cahill walked over as Ezra climbed down from the cab. "Beach is restricted," Cahill said, "not rude, just official. Active Coast Guard operation, insurance and safety protocols." "I heard," Ezra said. His voice was rough, shaped by decades of shouting over diesel engines and Atlantic wind. "Thought I might be able to help." Cahill looked at the International, looked at Ezra, looked back at the International. "Help with what?" "Pulling your lifeboat off those rocks." Cahill actually smiled. "Not mean, just automatic. Sir, that vessel weighs 10 tons, and it's impaled on granite in tidal conditions. We've got Navy salvage engineers saying it can't be done safely." "I heard that too," Ezra said, "but I've been pulling boats off Old Harbor Reef since before your station was built." Lieutenant Commander Walsh walked over. "Sir, we can't allow civilian contractors near an active demolition." "Ezra Blackwell," Ezra said, extending a hand. "Navy Salvage Unit 12, 1942 to 46. Worked these waters 78 years, last 45 of them pulling boats off rocks just like those." Walsh's expression shifted slightly. "Navy to Navy. Even with salvage experience, the tidal window is too narrow, and the reef formation makes it impossible to." "Impossible from a boat," Ezra interrupted quietly. "Not impossible from shore. Different angle, different leverage. Different timing." Cahill looked at the stranded lifeboat, at the reef, at the ocean that would be rising again in 4 hours. "Lieutenant Commander Walsh, your professional opinion." "It won't work, sir. The physics alone make it impossible. And that truck," she looked at the International, "it's from the 1950s. It couldn't generate enough force to move a modern lifeboat even if the conditions were perfect." "Mr. Blackwell." "It'll work," Ezra said simply. "Done it before. Same reef, same tides, heavier boats, just need to time it right." Cahill made a decision that would either save his career or end it. "You've got one tidal cycle, Mr. Blackwell, 6 hours. If it doesn't work, we proceed with demolition." Ezra nodded. "I'll need 4. Let me tell you about the 1951 International L-170, because understanding the machine is the only way to understand what Ezra did next. The International L-170 was built in Fort Wayne, Indiana in 1951 for light to medium recovery work. The Navy had bought several dozen for shore-based salvage operations at coastal stations. It had an inline-six gasoline engine that made about 120 horsepower. Not impressive, but the L-170 wasn't built for highway speed. It was built for sustained pulling in conditions where stopping meant starting over. The boom was simple steel construction, but Ezra had reinforced it with marine-grade materials over 45 years. The winch was mechanically driven through a power takeoff system with a 6-stage planetary reduction that multiplied pulling force by a factor of 14. More importantly, Ezra had adapted every system for salt water. The cable was marine-grade stainless. The winch drum was bronze. Every electrical connection was waterproofed. The truck had pulled boats through tide pools, across beaches, and out of surf for 4.5 decades. Ezra positioned the International at the high tide line, on a section of beach he knew from memory, solid sand over bedrock, stable enough to anchor against pulling forces. Then he began his preparation. First, the timing. Ezra pulled out a tide chart and his grandfather's pocket watch. High tide would peak at 18:47 hours, about 3 hours away, but Ezra wasn't going to pull at high tide. He was going to pull at the turn, when the tide was still high enough to float the lifeboat but starting to drop, reducing the upward pressure that was holding the boat on the rocks. Next, the anchors. Ezra pulled 4 massive sand augers from the truck bed, corkscrews of steel 3 feet long. He positioned them in a rectangle behind the International and screwed them deep into the sand, twisting them down until they hit bedrock. These weren't safety measures, they were engineering. When 10 tons of lifeboat came off those rocks, it would try to pull the International into the ocean. The augers would transfer that force directly into Cape Cod bedrock. Then Ezra did something that made Walsh actually object. He waded into the Atlantic. "Mr. Blackwell," Walsh called out, "that water's 50 degrees, the current." Ezra kept walking. He knew this reef. He'd been swimming it since he was 8 years old, before the Coast Guard station existed, before most of these rocks had names. He waded out 200 yards, timing his movement between wave sets, until he reached the stranded lifeboat. He climbed onto the tilted deck, studied the hull breaches, examined the rock formation underneath. Then he did something that showed 45 years of salvage experience. He didn't attach his cable to the strongest point on the boat. He attached it to a specific spot on the frame that would create a rotational force when pulled, a force that would lift the bow while sliding the stern, using the rocks themselves as leverage points instead of obstacles. He secured the connection with marine shackles, tested it with his weight, and waded back to shore. By the time he reached the beach, he was soaked and breathing hard. 78 years old, wading through 50-degree Atlantic water. "You all right?" Cahill asked. "Fine," Ezra said. "Did this in the North Atlantic in 43. This is warm." He walked back to the International, toweled off, and checked his tide chart again. 90 minutes until optimal pull time. Ezra spent that time rigging his cable system with the precision of a surgeon. He ran the main cable from the winch through a series of snatch blocks positioned at calculated points on the beach. Each block redirected the force and multiplied it through mechanical advantage. The Coast Guard personnel watched now, some skeptical, others curious. Walsh was taking photos, probably for the report she'd write later. At 18:35 hours, Ezra climbed into the International and started the winch. The sound was different from modern hydraulic systems, slower, more mechanical, a rhythmic clicking as the planetary gears engaged. The cable went taut, the snatch blocks took the load, the International's frame settled onto its suspension. For 2 minutes, nothing visible happened except the cable getting tighter. Then the tide turned. Ezra had timed it perfectly. The ocean was at its peak, starting to drop. The wave action that had been lifting the lifeboat and slamming it back down was beginning to ease. At 18:42, Ezra opened the throttle. The International's engine note changed. The winch turned faster. The cable stretched, not breaking, just settling under load that would have snapped civilian equipment. The Coast Guard 47-foot motor lifeboat moved. Not much, an inch, maybe 2, but 10 tons of fiberglass hull shifted position on rocks that had held it for 18 hours. "It's working," someone whispered. The lifeboat began to rotate. The bow lifted slightly. The stern slid sideways. Ezra was using the rocks as fulcrums, letting physics do what force couldn't. 3 inches, 6 inches. A wave surged in bigger than the rest. For a moment, Walsh thought it would slam the boat back down, break Ezra's cables, end the attempt. But Ezra had timed for this too. He increased winch speed just as the wave lifted the boat, using the ocean's own force to assist the pull. The lifeboat came off the reef. Not slowly, not gradually. One moment it was stuck, the next it was floating, sliding sideways off the rocks in a cascade of displaced water and broken barnacles. The Coast Guard crew erupted. People were shouting, pointing, some actually cheering despite military discipline. Ezra kept the winch turning. He pulled the lifeboat across 200 yards of shallow water, timing his pulls between wave sets until the vessel's keel scraped sand on the beach. When the lifeboat was safely grounded on the beach, Ezra shut down the winch, set the brake, and climbed out of the International. He began coiling his cable without ceremony. Lieutenant Cahill walked over. He didn't say anything for a long moment. How, he finally asked. We had engineers, we had computer models of the reef formation, we had tidal predictions. Everything said it couldn't be done safely in the time available. Your engineers were thinking about the boat, Ezra said, still working. I was thinking about the ocean, tide, waves, bottom composition, the boat's just cargo, the ocean's what you have to understand. He patted the International's fender. This truck's 45 years old. No computers, no hydraulics, just mechanical advantage and a man who knows when to pull and when to wait. What do we owe you? Nothing, Ezra said. Did it for the same reason I pulled boats in the war. Some things belong in the water, some things don't. That lifeboat saves lives, worth saving. There's got to be something. Ezra thought for a moment. Cape Cod Maritime Museum. They're trying to restore a WWII Navy salvage vessel. Donate whatever you think is fair. Cahill made a call. Within the hour, the Coast Guard District Office had authorized a $20,000 donation to the museum in Ezra Blackwell's name. Ezra nodded, climbed into the International, and drove up the beach access road. As the old wrecker disappeared toward town, Lieutenant Commander Walsh stood with her tablet, looking at data that didn't match the result. That shouldn't have worked, Walsh said. The pulling angle alone violated standard salvage protocols. The tidal timing was too narrow. The equipment was obsolete. But it did work, Cahill said quietly. And I'm starting to think that's the difference between what we learned in the academy and what he learned in the Atlantic in 1943. But the story doesn't end there. Let me tell you what happened 10 weeks later, because that's when Ezra made the discovery. The International had been making a grinding noise in the winch system since the lifeboat recovery. Nothing critical, just an irregular sound that Ezra couldn't identify. He suspected a damaged bearing in the planetary reduction, stressed by pulling 10 tons off granite. He pulled the truck into his shop, a weathered building on Chatham Harbor that had been in his family since 1891, and began a complete winch disassembly. The winch drum was solid bronze, 4 feet in diameter, with the cable spooled around it in precise layers. Ezra had rebuilt this system 3 times over 45 years, but he'd never completely removed the drum from its housing. This time he did. When the drum finally came free, Ezra noticed something odd. The drum was heavier than it should be. He measured it. The bronze casting was thicker on one end than the other. He tapped it with a wrench. One section sounded hollow. Someone had modified the drum, created a void space inside the bronze casting, and sealed it with a plug that was nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. Ezra spent the next 2 hours carefully drilling through the plug. When it finally came free, he found a waterproofed oilskin package inside the hollow core. His hands were shaking as he opened it. Inside, sealed with maritime wax and wrapped in canvas. An antique brass naval sextant, beautiful and functional, with an engraving on the base. RMS Titanic Relief Expedition, SS Carpathia, April 1912. 12 pages of handwritten manifests on waterproof paper, dated 1927-1932, detailing rum-running cargo routes from Halifax, Nova Scotia, to Boston, Massachusetts. The manifests listed ships, cargo quantities, delivery dates, and payment amounts. At the bottom of several pages, E. Blackwell, Captain. A property deed dated 1928 for 3 acres of land described as Private Island, Nantucket Sound, Massachusetts. The deed was in the name of Elias Blackwell. $7,900 in U.S. currency, mostly 20s and 50s, nothing newer than 1933. And a letter written in careful script on maritime stationery. To whoever finds this, my name is Elias Blackwell. If you're reading this, I am likely dead, and you found what I hid in 1933 when Prohibition ended and men like me became criminals instead of businessmen. The sextant belonged to my father, Captain Ezra Blackwell, who served aboard SS Carpathia when she rescued survivors from RMS Titanic in April 1912. My father was 4th officer on watch when they received the distress call. The sextant was given to him by Carpathia's captain after that night, in recognition of his navigation work during the rescue. It's the most valuable thing our family owns, not in money, but in what it represents, men doing their duty when it mattered most. The manifests are records of my other work. From 1927 to 1933, I ran rum from Canada to Massachusetts. Good rum, fairly priced, delivered reliably. I made money. I broke the law. I don't apologize for either. Prohibition was foolish, and foolish laws make honest men criminals. The island deed is real. I bought those 3 acres in 1928 with rum money, thinking I'd build a house there someday. Never did. The island's yours now, if you want it. The money is what I couldn't spend before Prohibition ended. I was going to buy a bigger boat, expand operations. Then the law changed, and rum-running became legal business again, except I was too old to start over and too known to be trusted. I'm hiding this in the winch drum because the wrecker will outlast me. Blackwells keep their equipment running. Whoever inherits this truck will find this eventually. Use the money however you see fit. Keep the sextant if you're family, donate it if you're not. And the island, well, land's land. It'll be there long after we're all gone. The ocean doesn't care about our laws or our money or our plans. It just keeps coming in and going out, the way it has for millions of years. I made my peace with that. Captain Elias Blackwell, March 15, 1933. Ezra sat in his shop, holding a sextant from the Titanic rescue and reading about his grandfather's crimes, and understood something he'd never fully known. Elias Blackwell had been a rum runner, had broken federal law for 6 years, made a fortune doing it, and hidden the evidence inside a winch drum where it wouldn't be found until the law and the men who enforced it were long dead. The International L-170 had been purchased in 1951 by Ezra's father, who died in 1963. The truck had passed to Ezra, who'd been using it for 33 years without knowing what was hidden inside. Let me tell you what Ezra did with that discovery. He kept the sextant, mounted it in a case in his shop, next to a photograph of SS Carpathia and a list of the 705 Titanic survivors she'd rescued. The rum-running manifests he donated to the Cape Cod Maritime Museum, where they became part of an exhibit on Prohibition-era smuggling. The documents provided detail about operations that historians had known existed, but never been able to document. The island deed presented a different problem. The 3 acres existed. Ezra found them on modern charts, a small rocky island in Nantucket Sound that had never been developed. The current assessed value, according to a real estate attorney Ezra consulted, was approximately $2.8 million. Ezra could have claimed it. The deed was legal. The property was his by inheritance. Instead, he donated it to the Massachusetts Audubon Society for seabird conservation. My grandfather bought that island with illegal money, Ezra told the Audubon director. Seems right that it should do some legal good now. Birds don't care how it was purchased. The currency, Ezra used it to establish the Elias Blackwell Maritime Scholarship at Massachusetts Maritime Academy for students studying marine salvage and recovery operations. My grandfather broke laws, Ezra said at the scholarship announcement, but he understood the ocean, and he knew that someday someone would need to know what he knew. This money should teach people the things that matter, tides, weather, how to move things that don't want to be moved. The International stayed in Ezra's shop. He drove it for another 4 years, until 2000, when he was 82, and his doctor told him his heart couldn't take the physical strain anymore. Truck still runs, Ezra said. That's not the point, his daughter said. Ezra looked at the International, sitting in the shop where it had sat for 49 years. Dark red paint, salt corrosion, the winch drum that had held his grandfather's secrets for 67 years. All right, he said, but it doesn't get scrapped. The Cape Cod Maritime Museum took it. They restored it carefully, keeping Ezra's modifications intact, and placed it in their main exhibit hall. The plaque reads, 1951, International L-170 Wrecker. Operator, Captain Ezra Blackwell, USN Ret. 1951-2000. This vehicle recovered Coast Guard motor, lifeboat 47,238 from Old Harbor Reef in 1996, when Navy salvage engineers declared recovery impossible. Maritime knowledge, some things can't be learned from manuals, they can only be earned from the sea. Ezra Blackwell died in 2004 at the age of 86. His funeral was held with maritime honors at Chatham's Seaside Cemetery, overlooking the Atlantic. He'd worked for 78 years. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, retired from the Coast Guard, gave the eulogy. Ezra Blackwell taught the United States Coast Guard something we'd forgotten, Walsh said. He taught us that maritime operations aren't about having the newest equipment or the most advanced technology. They're about understanding the ocean, understanding that it operates on principles that were old when our country was young and will still be true when our equipment is obsolete. She looked at the casket. He pulled a lifeboat off rocks we said couldn't be navigated. He did it with a truck from 1951 and knowledge from 1943. And he reminded us that some wisdom can't be found in academies or manuals. It can only be learned from men who have spent their lives listening to what the ocean teaches. The 1951 International still sits in the Cape Cod Maritime Museum. Next to it is Elias Blackwell's sextant from the Carpathia, the Prohibition-era rum-running manifests, and a photograph of the 1996 lifeboat recovery. Every October, on the anniversary of the Old Harbor Reef rescue, someone from Coast Guard Station Chatham visits the museum and leaves a Coast Guard Challenge coin on the truck's running board. A reminder that some knowledge can't be learned from computers or textbooks, that some problems can't be solved with modern equipment and institutional procedures, and that sometimes, when the Coast Guard says nothing can pull it out, all you need is an old Cape Cod fisherman who understands that the ocean doesn't care about your rank, your technology, or your timeline. It only cares whether you understand the tides. The Coast Guard said nothing could pull it out. The old man fired up his 1951 International and proved that men who listen to the ocean will always know more than men who give it orders.